Hello, and welcome to the first edition of the Bishkek Express Podcast, a podcast where in each episode we discuss topics in Kyrgyzstan, Central Asia, and beyond. I'm your host, Austin Reach, an intern for Evidence Central Asia. In today's podcast, we are joined by Dr. Anselm Hager, an assistant professor of international politics at Humboldt University of Berlin. Dr. Hager has produced works such as Does Party Competition Affect Political Activism? The Impact of Exposure to Refugees on Prosocial Behavior, and Does State Repression Spark Protest? Evidence from Secret Police Surveillance in Communist Poland. Today, we will be discussing a future publication titled Common Knowledge of Social Norms and Political Behavior. Taking place in Kyrgyzstan, we will learn how awareness of established social norms can influence Kyrgyz women's political behavior. Dr. Hager, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, to start off with, can you please introduce yourself and tell our listeners a little bit about your background and what you do?
Yeah. So I'm Anselm Hager, as you said, or in German, Anselm Hager. I'm based in Berlin. I'm an assistant professor there, as you said, at Humboldt University, which is, one of the big universities in Berlin. Lots of, former Nobel Prize winners and all that. So it's a nice place. And I got my PhD in the US. At Columbia in New York, and I've always sort of focused on comparative politics, political economy, international politics. So I'm somewhere in that realm. Although I should say I do quite a bit of sort of interdisciplinary work. I like working with sociologists and economists and political scientists. So I really, try to look at the world in a fairly open-minded way when it comes to sort of the disciplinary background of my training in a way. And I guess I'm here now in Bishkek. I've done some work prior on Kyrgyzstan, which was published, I think, 3 years ago, but it always takes forever to publish anything. And now I'm here for a new project that we're doing together with Evidence Central Asia and a few other colleagues. So that's why I'm in Bishkek, and I'm enjoying a hot summer in the steppe.
And your first impression so far of Bishkek?
I really like Bishkek. I have a sort of a small love, relationship with Bishkek. I think it's a fantastic town. It has a super nice vibe. I don't know what it is. It sometimes feels almost like a time capsule to like former times. Not necessarily sort of Soviet Union, although it definitely has that flair too with all the sort of old buildings. But it has a really interesting mix of sort of being a capital, but also being a little bit peripheral in a way. So I was just in Almaty a couple of days ago, which is, of course, the former capital of Kazakhstan. And it's very different, although it's equally situated against, a mountain range in the sort of outpost of the steppe, but it's much more Western. And so I really didn't get the same nice vibe that I'm getting in Bishkek. So I was very happy to come back. And yeah, so I really like it. It's a very chill town with lots of cool things to do. And of course, the nature here is just fantastic. So I'm a big fan.
Is this your first time in Central Asia?
No, it's not. So I think my interest in Central Asia began when I I drove here with my car with two friends after college. So I did a big trip to Central Asia. And that's when I sort of first really got to know the region. And I always like to say that the best way to get to know people is to drive and just to be part of sort of, the whole, getting from A to B and everything in the city. So I think driving really in some funny way really puts you in the center of a society. So anyway, so we had a great time here, went to Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, many other Stan countries, and then back through Russia. And that was sort of my first personal encounter with the region. And then that led toward, as I said, a first research project, which we, I think, did in 2016, 2017 on southern Kyrgyzstan. Then I wanted to work on it again. So I teamed up with a few colleagues and we got a grant, which is a nice project, which I guess I'll talk about a little bit more. And here I am back in Kyrgyzstan. And I'm also planning a new project. So maybe there's a follow-up, hopefully. Very different topic, but I seem to now have some small sort of focus on Central Asia and Kyrgyzstan in particular.
Oh, that's lovely. It's a very romantic introduction to Central Asia.
Yeah.
Very detailed.
Yeah.
Yes. So I was creeping on you on Google Scholar, and it seemed like your last name was different. There was Rink?
Yes.
Okay.
That is a common... It's quite unusual. So I got married, and then I switched my last name. My wife had a better, bargaining position in a way.
Oh, okay.
No, I mean, I switched my last name. I wasn't very attached to the name before. It's very unusual in academia, I must say, but it's been fine. So if anyone ever wants to change their name in academia, it turns out it's totally fine. There was no sort of negative repercussions of any sort. You can still publish and do your thing, and people will still recognize you. Sometimes they're a little bit confused about the last name, but that'll wear off.
Okay, I was just curious because there was one article you wrote that I wanted to mention later on, but I'm glad it's
the
still
same
you.
person. It's not. I don't have multiple personalities.
Okay, interesting. So, like I said, I was checking out your publications on Google Scholar, and I see some motifs with your work. It seems there's a trend in researching political behavior, social dynamics, and inequality. What inspired you to get into this area of your studies?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy that you have found a nice summary of my work because I always struggle, I have to be honest. But I think I agree that one thing I'm really interested in is sort of more contentious political action. So not necessarily, attitude formation as much or voting behavior, but more importantly, things where people sort of go the extra step, which could be, protests or activism, knocking on doors, but it could also be violence. So I'm really interested in that. And I think it's just something I can't quite explain why I find it so interesting, partly because it's, of course, somewhat shocking to see, not always shocking, but oftentimes when you see these big uprisings, riots, revolts, and you're like, why does this happen? Mm-hmm. And so that motivates me quite a bit. But I must say, as you rightly say, that's sort of one focus that I have. The other focus certainly is inequality. How do, societies become unequal? How do they manage that inequality? And what institutions are there that sort of foster it? What institutions are there that diminish inequality? So I'm very interested in that as well. Because it's just a common, no matter where you are in the world, there's different inequalities and different ways how humans deal with these inequalities and different ways in which these inequalities come out. It could be ethnic, it could be racial, it could be economic, it could be political. So there's always different markers that are politicized and become relevant when you study inequality. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Again, skimming some of the abstracts, I saw that there was articles such as, do inheritance customs affect political and social inequality? So it seems you also have an interest in gender studies. Could you say that?
I mean, so I wouldn't say that it's maybe not gender studies per se, because I don't want to pretend like I'm a gender studies expert, which I'm really not. But being interested in inequality, of course, gender inequality is one of the big markers of inequality, right? So by being interested in inequality, you necessarily have to be somewhat interested in gender. And as you rightly say, so this project was a project on inheritance as one way to how economic inequality in society is really festered. Excuse me. And one way this plays out, of course, historically at least, but also today, is along gender lines. Mm-hmm. So for most of history, of course, the people that inherited were men. Most, in some societies at least, firstborn men. So you have this really interesting inequality that it's really one guy in the family that gets everything. Sometimes it's also the last-born son, interestingly enough. But anyway, and of course that is an institution that really breeds inequality, which is both a gender inequality, but also sort of a broader inequality. So it is a nice study or nice context within which you can sort of look at these different inequalities, how they overlap, interact over time. And that's how that paper came about. And I think it's also sort of shows that I'm very interested in history. Mm-hmm. I haven't, published too many papers on history because it's difficult to do them, because there's so much data that you could possibly analyze and so many archives you could go to. But I'm very interested in it. And that paper was one historic paper that I did.
And it was about Germany. I skimmed it, but it was about Germany. Yes.
Yeah.
So what's the inheritance custom in Germany?
Right. So as I just said, there's historically societies differ in the way they structure inheritance. So whether they, give every child an equal amount, sort of, a third or something like that, or whether they give one child pretty much everything. And that differs across the world. And there's a really famous French sociologist, Emmanuel Todd, who has a very provocative book on that. And he sort of says the Germans are very authoritarian because they give all the inheritance to the firstborn child, which really creates this sort of patriarchal society. And he compares that to many countries, but also France, which, at least after the French Revolution, did what's called as partible inheritance, so splitting it up between different siblings, which he argues makes France more egalitarian and, I guess, democratic in a way. So I thought that was a really thought-provoking thesis, and I also thought, inheritance is a big deal in many families. Many families have fights over inheritance. There's a lot of differences across the world. Some countries have almost no inheritance tax. Some countries have high inheritance taxes. So I was very interested in that. And but being interested is not enough to study something. You have to find a way to study it well and to really test some hypotheses rigorously. And then what I found out is that in Germany, unlike what the French sociologist said, there's actually really interesting variation, especially in the Southwest. You go from one village to the next, and historically, they structured inheritance very differently. It's kind of fascinating. In one village, the firstborn son gets everything. Next village, equal inheritance. So, they split it up amongst siblings, which is super interesting, very difficult to explain. And I use that sort of as a natural laboratory, almost like a natural experiment, as though someone had, gone across these villages and changed how inheritance is done, almost like that. Of course, that didn't happen. And then I study what happens to political and social inequality. And I do find that when you deal with inheritance in a fair or equitable manner, societies tend to be more politically and socially equal. But, and that's the kicker, they're also economically more unequal. I don't quite know why that is, but, talking about the US, which had a very similar debate how to do inheritance when the country was founded, one argument in favor of splitting it up fairly is that every child gets a fair chance of succeeding, and then the best can sort of make it to the top. So in a funny way, it might actually breed inequality by giving everyone the same, sort of leveling the playing field. And then you have these, Bezos or Gates that really sort of shoot through the stars. Whereas if you give everything to the firstborn son, maybe that son is a little bit, complacent or wants to stick all the money into a castle or whatever it is. And then you have less sort of economic innovation.
Wow. I'll have to wind up reading that paper because that's very interesting. And where are you from in Germany? What region?
So I was born in Frankfurt, which is West Germany, central West Germany. And I grew up around there. We moved quite a bit, but I'm sort of from that region. Okay. And then I went abroad after high school to study, and now I'm back.
Are you familiar with your region or your hometown's type of inheritance custom?
Well, Frankfurt is a city, so that it didn't apply there. I could check the data that we have. I'm sure we have some data on it. But I will say that in my family too, there was, there wasn't a lot to inherit, but it was a common thing that, the brother got everything, even if it was just, I don't know, a couple thousand Deutschmarks at the time. It was a thing. It was a thing that really led to this impression that it's unfair. And so there's some sort of personal background there, although I was not personally involved. But I feel like oftentimes research, of course, has some personal connection, even if it's just your personal interest, right? So even if you're not literally had the same experience, where's your interest coming from, right? There's got to be some biographical element. And in most of my work, I can rationalize why I'm interested in it. Yeah.
And not to go on a tangent, but last summer I was dealing with the passing of my father. And fortunately, it was a very egalitarian split. But some people end up fighting over forks and spoons in the cabinets.
Yeah. So it shows. Even if you have an equal split, you can still have all these emotions. How much, who deserves what, so that's why I was partly interested in it. But yeah, so it's interesting to see that it has these lasting effects on inequality, political engagement, and the likes.
Mm-hmm. So this is a working document, and we're going to talk about Kyrgyz women. So based off your previous research, can you find some parallels, or is there something you could draw from previous studies into this one about Kyrgyz women?
Right. So this paper, I should sort of, the broader context is it's a study that takes place in what's called metacata. There are 5 different studies being undertaken in 5 countries. Mm-hmm. The fundamental hypothesis in these in these studies is to see whether female political engagement can be driven by collective efficacy, a sort of sense that you are collectively powerful, efficacious as women and as a sort of women in a community. So that's the broader project, which takes place in 5 countries. And then we also, and the working paper that I shared is a second project that we did exclusively in Kyrgyzstan. So the way it works is that it's a sort of meta study across 5 countries. We are dealing with Kyrgyzstan, others are in Malawi and Vietnam, etc.
Okay.
And you can, if the viewers want to check it out, it's all online. And then we have our own project. Now, the own project looks at social norms and female political engagement. And I think there is certainly some overlap to prior projects. First is, being sort of politically engaged in a community. So I have a lot of papers on canvassing, on political activism, on participating in protests. So this idea that you do more than just voting, that you go into the community and you do some sort of political activity. So there's a link there. And there's also a link to social norms. So in the past, I've worked a little bit on that. What do you think others want you to do? Sort of playing with that idea, like to what extent your behavior is shaped by what others think you should be doing or society should be doing. And of course, there's a link to, the female inequality, women's inequality, especially with reference to the paper that we did on inheritance. Although, of course, now we're not studying inheritance, but again, it's this idea that there's clearly profound inequalities, how men act in communities or to what extent they engage, who holds power and how women do. And so that's what we study, of course, as well in that paper.
Can you remind me one more time what this type of study is called? A meta-keto?
Yeah, well, so it's the project or this agenda, if you will, is called meta-keta.
Meta-keto, okay.
And it's the idea that you do one study in 5 different contexts.
Okay.
And why do you do that? Because many studies are drawn from just one context. And then you never quite know, is this result meaningful more generally? Or does this only hold in wherever you happen to study it? Poland, Peru, whatever. And the idea here is that you do one study in 5 contexts to understand, okay, is this something that travels to other contexts? And if not, what sort of contextual factors might explain differences? Although the latter question is difficult to answer.
Okay. And more about your research. You've already explained that you did have a spark in interest in Central Asia. You did the road trip, but your research spans multiple continents, Africa, Western Europe. Do you have a favorite area to focus on, or is there something you find yourself studying more than other regions?
No, I don't have a favorite. I like to study things where they can be studied best. Now, that means I'm a little bit loosey-goosey on what context I focus on. So as you say, I've worked in many different countries, and that has a downside because, of course, I don't have the same in-depth contextual understanding compared to someone who's been, studying a country for 15 years. I've only been there. I always make an effort I always go to the country, I always spend time there, I always do qualitative interviews. So I try to get to know the context. But of course, it's very different to say someone who's really been there for a long time. That said, I think it also has an advantage of sort of studying many countries because you can really nicely compare and see patterns that are similar. So for example, inheritance, it happens to be similar in, say, African country A versus European country B. So there's some interesting similarities there too. I don't have favorites. I will say I have now started doing some projects on Germany during COVID because I couldn't travel. And of course that is super much easier because I speak the language and the data is really available. And going to, now I'm trying to work on something Imperial Russia and Kyrgyzstan, and I don't speak Russian. I'm trying, but I'm failing. And so it's so difficult. Whereas, of course, when I'm in Berlin, I can just go to the archive and that's that. So I don't have a favorite, but Germany definitely is easiest for me personally. There's a funny joke in the discipline that I've heard that, people usually, back in the day when people used to write books, or used to write more books, I should say, the second or third project would always be somewhere in Western Europe, so that you would do a project in France or Italy because the food's great. But I haven't come to that point, so I haven't done any work on France or Italy. So I'm still going to different sort of farther away places.
Yes. And from what I remember, you have within Germany studies about welfare inequality. You had the inheritance customs, and was there something else regarding Germany?
Yeah, we've done some projects on voting behavior, on discrimination, on attitudes towards migrants. So these are more, I consider them more of like my policy relevant publications in a way. They're less in a way theoretically rich, but they I think are more policy relevant. They definitely are. It's funny because sometimes, as academics, we write papers and then we feel like no one reads them. But these papers get cited even in the Bundestag, so they really do form policy, which I was surprised to see. And so, yeah, but they're sort of more policy relevant, and then the papers that I do abroad tend to be a little bit more theoretically focused. Yeah.
Okay, very well. And because there are multiple authors for this research, did you bring a particular expertise or a particular focus? Did you contribute more to one area of this working paper we'll talk about today?
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting question, how to structure research teams, because you don't want to have too many people, you don't want to have too few in a way, although I'd like to work on my own too. So in this case, the way it worked, I spoke with Lucas Hensel, who's an economist now at Peking University. And so we have worked quite a bit, and we get along great. And so we sort of think alike. That was great. And then I've also had prior contact with Damir, who is super knowledgeable and also knows the context like, second to none. So he's Kyrgyz citizen too, lives in Berlin. So he really has very deep contextual knowledge, but also a lot of work on sort of inequality and attitudes, etc., in Central Asia. So he was a natural fit. And then the fourth co-author is Elnura, who has very deep subject matter expertise, most importantly on female engagement in local Kyrgyz villages. And so she was also a natural fit, and it's been going great. So sometimes projects don't go great. That one's been really fantastic.
I'm glad to hear that, and we're all very excited to see it come together. And you explained this to me before the interview started. Sorry to make you hash it out again, but for our audience, and this will also be the last introductory question before we dive in. So along with you, there's Damir, Esen Aliyev, Lucas Hensel, and the woman who afforded me this internship, the Honorable Elnora Kazakbayeva. So can you tell me how all of you became acquainted in the first place?
Right. So Lucas and I, as I just mentioned, we've been working on a bunch of papers on political activism. So we've known each other for a couple of years, I guess almost 5 or 6 years now. So that's that. And Damir, I got to know via a prior project on Kyrgyzstan, which I did with 2 other co-authors. And we were looking for some more data to probe a specific sort of question. And he's been engaged in a great panel study, Life in Kyrgyzstan, that's really been going on forever, it feels like. It's a fantastic panel. And he very graciously gave us that data. And so I got in touch with him, and that's how we met. And then as we were preparing to apply for this Metaketa initiative and the grant, we asked Damir, do you know anyone who knows this context and this particular topic, like no one else? And then he said, well, that would be Elnura. And so we took Elnura on board, and yeah, that's how the project came about.
All right. Very good introduction. So let's take a look at this paper you're working on. To start off with, I'll deliver an overview of what we'll be talking about today by reading the abstract of this article aloud. Again, because I've looked at a couple different drafts, I don't know whose abstract this is, but if there's something erroneous, just let me know. So, we studied the role of common knowledge about perceived social norms in shaping female political participation. We experimentally provide information about both others' privately held opinions and their perception of the prevailing social norm. We find that information about others' private opinion has no effect on attendance of a community meeting. However, women become less likely to attend community meetings when we experimentally create common knowledge about social norms opposing female engagement. At the same time, there is no positive effect on behavior when providing common knowledge about high social support. Using vignettes, we provide further evidence suggesting that this asymmetry arises because the fear of social punishment is stronger than the utility of potential community praise. There's some interesting things that pop up within your introduction. The first sentence reads, Social norms are powerful predictors of human behavior. Individuals have been shown to change outcomes, including labor force participation, prosocial behavior, and political engagement when told that others view such behavior positively. For our listeners who might be unfamiliar with Kyrgyzstan or Central Asia, can we go over some social norms that are unique to Kyrgyzstan or maybe this region? Maybe that's too broad, but at least Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question that I cannot answer because I haven't studied, differences in social norms in Kyrgyzstan, say, compared to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, China, maybe Tajikistan. And my hunch is that, well, of course, there are differences in social norms across the globe, that's for sure. But there's also a lot of norms that are very similar globally. And there's some really interesting research on that too. So that, there's a certain norm against hitting people. There's a norm against spitting on the ground, these kinds of things. So there's many social norms. And I think the sort of main takeaway is that they structure what we do and what we don't do. And of course, they have different effects on different people. Some people might not care what others think. Although I think sometimes that may be, a bit pretended. Because I feel like at the end of the day, everyone has some reaction to social norms. Because of course, social norms, and that's the important point, they tend to go hand in hand with punishment mechanisms or praise mechanisms, if you will. And that's sort of what we're after in this paper. But to answer your question, I have not studied to what extent Kyrgyz norms differ from Kazakh norms. And I don't want to sort of get into tropes or stereotypes. But I wouldn't even. My hunch would be that at least compared to Kazakhstan, which I know a little bit better, I wouldn't expect behavior to dramatically differ. It certainly would be different in, say, Western Europe, right? So a norm, for example, pertaining to female engagement or female political activism, those norms are different in Central Asia compared to, say, Northern Europe, where there's a strong norm that, women and men should be equally engaged in a community, that gender should not somehow condition whether you're active or engaged. And that, of course, is a little bit different in Kyrgyzstan, especially in rural villages, which is the focus of our study.
Okay. So, yes, very broad question. I understand. So let's narrow it down and let's give our readers some understanding of some terms. First of all, how would you define prosocial behavior? It's mentioned in the very beginning of your article.
Yeah. It's a kind of a funny term. I think maybe technically speaking is that you get utility, a payoff, from others doing well. So that's one way of looking at it. There's maybe more concretely, there's a couple of interesting experimental games that are played to measure prosocial behavior. One would be what's known as a dictator game. So I give you, $100, and then I ask you how much of those $100 do you give to the next person? And economic, theory would predict, well, you give nothing to the next person, you just keep everything to yourself. So being completely selfish, quote unquote. But most people don't act like that. So the prosocial behavior would then be to what extent you pass any of that money on to the next person. Because you give up something that, belongs to you technically, your utility, you give that to the other person. So that's one, I think, nice way of thinking about it. There's, of course, different ways. And all these terms, what's selfish, you might still get a payoff of what's known as a warm glow of giving other people something. And then really you get that psychological payoff. So it's really, it gets a little bit philosophical trying to figure out what really is selfish and what is altruistic. But at the end of the day, it's this idea that you give to other people,
Okay.
At least materially speaking. Yeah.
All right. Well, we have a nice working definition at this point. So, of these social norms that you have, well, it's a very broad thing. We don't want to generalize. So, could you tell us if there are any social norms that may have a large impact on prosocial behavior and political engagement in Kyrgyzstan?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of norms that in Kyrgyzstan and elsewhere that require prosocial behavior. As a matter of fact, I don't think there's many norms that go against prosocial behavior. So there's norms, for example, that you give someone something for their wedding or you give them a present. There's a norm of tipping, at a restaurant. So these kinds of things. There's lots of norms that sort of undergird prosocial behavior and sort of provide a bit of grease in social interactions, if you will. And Kyrgyzstan, of course, most people in our sample, at least in most villages, are Muslim. And there's lots of norms in Islam that, require you to do good unto others, sort of golden rule, which is really interesting and shared amongst many religions. So there's lots of norms that really try to invoke being altruistic toward others.
I would agree with that. I've experienced many of those myself since I've been here for just 4 weeks.
Yeah, hospitality is another big one.
Huge.
Which me as a German, I mean, not again, I don't like these cultural stereotypes, but I think it is fair to say Germans are not the most hospitable people. And that, of course, is very different here. And hospitality is, you're not getting anything out of that by inviting other people. Well, materially speaking, it costs you money to invite someone over that is a complete stranger that you might never see again. But there's a strong norm of hospitality. So if you go to villages here, people will invite you in. They'll give you a tea. And so that is a strong norm. Again, that would be a nice example for invoking or sort of incentivizing, if you will, prosocial behavior in villages.
Yes, yeah. The hospitality is just so very touching.
Yeah.
And again, like you can find hospitality like elsewhere, whether it's Africa, like Latin America, wherever. But I will say for Kyrgyzstan, I've experienced Balkan hospitality. Like my landlord, when I was in Bulgaria, I met his grandmother within the first couple of days of knowing him. I didn't speak Bulgarian, like I barely knew his name. Was showed around. Same thing in the Caucasus. I mean, it's a hallmark of like Caucasian culture is the host, the guest, their duty to be a host. But here, I think I've been shown the greatest extent of hospitality, and it's been very, very touching. It's their insistence upon just making you feel, welcome, part of the community, not like a stranger.
And that's, I mean, if you notice this kind of variation, and I mean, I guess, if this were a study now, you would want to have some data on that and build some hypothesis why that is. And of course, it's difficult because the Balkans are different from, Central Asia for many reasons. But you could hypothesize, why might that be? And maybe one hypothesis I was thinking is that this, Kyrgyzstan, at least, parts of Kazakhstan too, of course, have a deep nomadic history. And so maybe that explains why you're even more focused on hospitality because, it's not a kind of society where everyone's always at the same kind of place in the same house. So maybe there's a extra focus societally on hospitality. I don't know. I'd have to see data, and testing the hypothesis is difficult, but it's just it's a nice illustration of how these kinds of institutions arise, or thinking through why that might be the case.
That's a really interesting assumption. I mean, to me, it makes sense. It's worth studying.
Yeah, but it's difficult because what we call endogeneity. So the Balkans, again, are different from Central Asia in many ways, not only because of different sort of nomadic history. So there's other differences, of course. So you never quite know what is driving the difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Understandable. Still sticking to social norms, do you think there's any interplay between traditional, maybe nomadic or Kyrgyz social norms and then the Soviet social norms that were implemented during that regime? Or do you think there's a clash between these structures of social norms?
That is a very interesting topic. I am reading a lot on it, but I'm not knowledgeable enough to talk about it. I will say the sort of this combination of institutions and political structures, but also cultural influences in Central Asia is fascinating. And just, within a short period of time from, the 1850s, when Kyrgyzstan was mostly nomadic, I mean, there was some settlements of agriculture, but that was usually, as far as I know, done by sort of the lower classes or castes. And then you get, Imperial Russia colonizing the place, taking land from nomads, settling people here, Cossacks and others, and bringing a very sort of new proto-capitalist, much more Western, quote unquote, way of doing everything in society, including private property. And then within a short period of time, you get the Soviet Union. So the Soviets come in, Bolsheviks come, take over, land, expropriate people, collectivize. So there's all these interesting intricacies and interactions of institutions and political players. And it's mind-blowing. And very interesting. Now, how those all work together is kind of beyond me. I think, again, as someone who hasn't studied this, who has only read some books on it, it seems to me that one thing the Soviet Union, of course, did, at least in Central Asia, is a fairly strong focus on egalitarianism. Like not having private property, having education for everyone, these kinds of things. Although, mind you, there was, of course, a lot of discrimination against Kyrgyz, so later the Russians that were in Kyrgyzstan were sort of the bosses, if you will. There was no question about that. But that said, if you talk to people in the villages, at least the memory, and that might be tainted, is that society was much more equal. Everyone had sort of similar property, etc. So there's this strong egalitarian element. And that may or may not be different from nomadic times. So, the nomads and the different clans, etc., there was a degree of egalitarianism, but there was also, of course, a lot of stratification. So it's complicated. It's not quite clear how that overlaps, but it's a really interesting topic for sure.
Within just personal conversations or even research, have you observed maybe a nostalgia for the past? Like in Bulgaria particularly, there's people I would talk to. Bulgaria was not in Yugoslavia, but the idea still applies of you go nostalgia. Oh, it was so much better back in the day. This was better. My life, everyday life, was better for XYZ reason. Have you sensed any nostalgia for Soviet Kyrgyzstan?
For sure.
Okay.
This is a different project that I'm just sort of trying to start now. And we did some qualitative interviews that go into that direction. And even if you don't ask about it, one thing people always want to talk about right now is the war in Ukraine. There is a deep, at least my impression, and again, this is not a representative survey, so take everything with a grain of salt. And I might be getting different answers than someone who's Kyrgyz who does these interviews. That said, there is a deep loyalty toward Russia. I felt like a need to defend Russia. Up to the point when I had these conversations, I was like, look, you can criticize your friend. Like your friend can make mistakes. And then they're like, yeah, I guess you're right. And I do think the war is stupid. So at some point they will get there. And then I'm like, and you saying it's a stupid war, if, I don't want to belittle it by calling it stupid, but like you think it's a ridiculous war. That doesn't, mean you have to give up your loyalty toward Russia. So anyway, so I think that war is a really interesting point for some Kyrgyz, not all, importantly, to feel the need to express loyalty toward Russia. There's a lot of sentiment back toward, the Soviet times, how things were easier and more structured and everyone sort of had their place and these kinds of things I'm hearing. But you should also be careful that that's something that you will hear in the villages amongst people that are a little bit older. Now you hear very different things in the capital when you talk to younger people who are much more, they still, of course, in Kyrgyzstan, often many people speak Russian and it's really dominant language still, and arguably maybe even getting more dominant because of social media and lots of media influences. But they are much more critical. So there is definitely some nostalgia, but I also don't want to overplay that.
Sure.
And of course, that's exactly the kind of situation where Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan find themselves in, that they have these deep ties, also some, of course, economic dependence, but they also want to really not be part of this. So they're really like stuck in between and have to maneuver this now at a sort of broader political level.
But I have noticed that I haven't met someone with an ambivalent opinion about the Ukraine war. It's more so that they're very straightforward about, we don't support Ukraine. We don't support Russia. We want the violence to end. But then it does take a more pro-Russia turn eventually after that conversation. But these are men my age.
Although I would say that's probably a general human tendency. It's hard to find anyone in the West who has like a ambivalent position about Ukraine. I think this is a general thing, that it's the kind of war and situation that just sparks moral outrage on both sides somehow. And there's very few people that are in between. Even me personally, it's like, I'm a scientist. I try to see, life for all the complexity that it has, and it's difficult to figure anything out really. So I have strong sympathy towards skepticism, but like in that war, I'm like, I can't, it's difficult for me to sympathize with the other side.
Certainly. Yeah.
So there's definitely this moral outrage in me as well, and I observed it. Then I'm like, maybe that's good. Maybe that makes me human in a way. But at the same time, it makes me like, oh wow, that doesn't feel very scientific. But anyway, so I think it's something that sort of holds more broadly globally. Yeah.
Yes, I do understand. So moving further along in this paragraph, I want to discuss another interesting term that I read. Within your second paragraph of the introduction, it is written, importantly, punishment may occur even if all members of a community privately are in favor of a given behavior, but all think others hold pessimistic views. And then in parentheses, we read pluralistic ignorance. Could you please explain this concept of pluralistic ignorance
Yeah.
and how it relates to social norms?
That is a really interesting concept, and that's not something we invented. There's other studies on that in psychology and many other fields. So, we're not innovative in any way. But it's this idea, as the sentence says, that people hold incorrect beliefs about what other people are thinking. So you could have a situation, let's take some hot button issue like abortion, where actually, I'm drawing numbers out of a hat now, 70 or 80% are in favor of it. But people think that others are not in favor of it. So they might, interestingly, even though they are personally in favor of it, and others on average, the majority or even super majority is in favor of it, they might still punish a behavior. Is that making sense? Mm-hmm. So it's the really interesting sort of the emperor has no clothes kind of situation, where and it's a problem. And of course it also has to do with who speaks up in a community. So in most communities that I've studied, you never get the median voter, as we call them, like the median citizen, to speak up. It's specific people that talk. Mm-hmm. It tends to be people that are in the extremes. Same, and of course, on Twitter and in any pretty much dialogue these days, which really distorts citizens' impression of what others are thinking. So it's not the only explanation, but there might, even independent of that kind of situation, might be the case that people are in favor of something, but think others are not. And then they feel the urge to defend a norm that is not even supported by society. Mm-hmm. And that's really the crux of the paper in a way, is to deal exactly with that issue, to experimentally intervene and update people's beliefs about what others are thinking and what others are thinking about others, mm-hmm. Which is a little bit, you have to think about it, but it's not super complicated, but it requires a bit of, thinking outside the box, if you will.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned update, because that was another thing I would like to ask about. It has to do with the posterior beliefs, with updating people's, mm-hmm. with the actual data, mm-hmm. correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the idea, this is, if we get into the design now, there is quite a few studies that have, and I've published some as well, that are asking someone, okay, so what is your belief about a certain issue? So take, for example, maybe we should concretely pick female engagement. So what do you think? How many people in society believe that women should be more active in politics? And so we take that belief, and then we provide you with what society thinks. We give you that information. And then we ask you again to sort of see, does that information that we're giving you lead to you updating your beliefs? Now, of course, this updating sometimes works better, sometimes works worse, depending on how sort of deeply entrenched the belief is. But in this paper, it's worked quite well, because apparently people are not super certain about what others are thinking. And so updating them, providing them with a different estimate, a different piece of information, does change beliefs.
Okay.
At least in the short term.
And still maintaining the focus on some vocabulary terms, social punishment. I'm assuming there is going to be overlap with social punishment in Africa, Europe, and whatever other continent. But is there something special about social punishment in Kyrgyzstan or for this study?
Not. So we haven't fully fleshed this out. We're collecting more data on exactly that phenomenon because we hadn't anticipated it. So this is the other thing about research. You have an idea, you do a study, you collect some data, and then you need more data because you have many more questions. So it's really, research always opens up more questions and answers few questions. That said, we have been given examples of sort of classic social punishment strategies. They don't strike me as fundamentally different to, say, a village in Kenya or a village in Slovakia or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's classic things. It's like gossip. You start, you do a certain behavior that others are perceiving as not socially or societally endorsed, and that leads to gossip. So it's like, oh, have you heard what X and Y has done? So gossip is one. Next one would be, it's a little bit more sort of more aggressive in a way. You're not being invited to a certain party. So there's a birthday party, you're not invited. everyone from, I guess, elementary school remembers that you're the one that's not invited. That really sucks. So there's a certain punishment there. You're excluded. And then there's different sort of paths or strategies. A third one we were told is, you could go to cutting of water or something like that, right? There's a water supply and then maybe you're cut off. That's a more drastic form, of course. It could be shaming. You are, approached and someone tells you shouldn't have done that. That's, we don't want that. So really like outright public shaming. And then, of course, this can go on. And there's really a litany of things humans have developed to punish others, if you will, for certain behavior that society deems not okay. Even, again, if everyone privately might think differently about it.
Reverting back to pluralistic ignorance, this question might sound like super tricky and condescending, but it's still something I'm interested in. How does pluralistic ignorance contribute to maintaining certain patterns of punishment and praise despite people's own individual beliefs?
Well, it's if it weren't for the fact that people have incorrect beliefs about what others are thinking, there wouldn't be any punishment happening, right? So it's sort of the sine qua non. You need that to be, if it is the case that 70% are in favor of a certain activity, but personally they don't know that and they think it's only 30%, then exactly that difference, which is pluralistic ignorance, is the reason why they feel the need to punish a certain activity. And of course, that in turn is conditional on norms that you should punish others, right? You could have a norm that don't engage with your neighbor, don't punish them, don't shame them, don't gossip, etc., etc. But it could also be the case that people think that is expected of them in the community to uphold social norms.
Okay.
And these are, there's lots of interesting psychological studies on this. To what extent do bystanders intervene if something negative happens? And many of these experiments, in an interesting way, rely on the assumption that we very much want others to intervene if there's something that is societally unacceptable. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for that explanation. I think that we have some of the more interesting vocabulary terms under our belt. So let's look at some more data in the introduction. So within the introduction, we read a brief synopsis of Kyrgyzstan as a country, along with some historical developments. It is mentioned that Kyrgyzstan boasts the achievement of appointing the first female president in Central Asia in the early 2010s. How does this historic milestone affect perceptions of female political leadership and women's representation?
Well, that is a great question, and I would encourage you to study it. I don't know. I mean, it was a short presidency, but I think it is a symbol or a nice, example that female engagement in politics in Kyrgyzstan is maybe more advanced than some people think, but definitely not at levels where it should be or where it is, for example, in Western societies. And I say should in quote unquote because, of course, we're always, I'm a Western scholar. I come from Western society, so it's a very fine line to have your own ideals and then project them onto other societies. So this is just the awkwardness. This may not be the right term, but of doing research in societies that are not your own on topics that are hot button. And so anyway, so I just wanted to sort of flag that. But whether there is any effect of that presidency on female engagement, I don't know. It is an interesting question. You could study that perhaps with a survey experiment or ask people if she as a role model perhaps sparked women to become more active. It could be. There is definitely some evidence on the relevance of role models. Certainly.
I was unaware that it was the first female president in Central Asia.
Yeah. But as far as I know, I mean, maybe I'm incorrect, but as far as I know, yeah.
I also read some articles easy Yahoo articles that said the same thing. So
yeah, okay.
I think it is true. Moving on to a religious dimension, and we won't just talk about Islam for the record.
Yeah.
Can you give us insights into how the surge in Islamic radicalism and patriarchal values lead women to be underrepresented in Kyrgyzstan's political landscape?
Yeah. So I haven't studied religion in Kyrgyzstan at all. So I don't want to preface every question with I haven't studied it, but I have not studied it. There is some data and some evidence that there has been an increase in religiosity, more women wearing headscarves. Also, a bit of evidence for radicalization, although I don't want to sort of paint that in a too broad brush. What effect that has had on political engagement, I don't know. It could have had a negative effect because, traditional values in Islam, but also other religions, are not, historically, have not been great champions of female, empowerment, especially in politics. That said, I haven't studied it. So, yeah.
Okay. I do have a personal insight about religion in Kyrgyzstan, and I would like your take on it. So, as I study in Prague, as you know, and there's a contact I have in Prague who hooked me up with some contacts here because just the network of hospitality, that's how it goes. Of course, I'd be taken care of here. So I've had separate contacts that were supposed to help me look for an apartment that would take me to the mountains on this weekend. Different people would take me to Issyk-Kul on this weekend. So I was very lucky to have that. By each group, I was showed tremendous hospitality. But for the group who took me to Issyk-Kul, I found it so interesting because they were hardliner Baptists, very, very devout, very, very theologically sound in their Baptist denomination. And it's such a wildly tight-knit community. And you mentioned tight-knit communities within your paper, specifically tight-knit. Within the church here in Bishkek, there's other Central Asian ethnicities that are Baptist Christian, even Turkmens, which I was very surprised to learn. And as I went to Issyk-Kul, we visited different little bitty villages. Some I'm going to butcher with the pronunciation, but like Grigorevka, Semenov, Shulpan Ata, and a couple others. And there are these little bitty pockets of not just Baptist churches, but these Baptist communities, and everybody knows each other. They have communion together, not literal communion, but they're eating lunch together. They're doing maybe a Bible study randomly at the church at all these different times. So I was surprised to know about like this burgeoning Christian community, but more specifically a Baptist burgeoning community. I haven't met with anybody who comes from a Pentecostal background or Lutheran or any Catholics. And since you wrote a piece, and I'm not going to pretend like I read it, I just skimmed the abstract. You wrote a piece about something to do with something to do with missionaries perhaps undermining political authority in Peru. And we're talking about things that might lead to women's underrepresentation. So it would not just be radical Islam, but even with strict interpretations of Baptist theology, do you think that maybe this burgeoning population, I consider it like growing because I only see more and more people, and even they talk about more and more adherence to their church. So do you think that this maybe strict Protestant theology is also undermining women's representation in Kyrgyz politics?
Interesting. I mean, so I think in general with religion and these smaller sort of sects, denominations, it's important to have representative data because these small groups tend to be very vocal and very tightly knit. And when you're there, you feel like, oh my God, wow. And then they tell you, we're growing and, it's such a huge church and all that. And it has this impression of, wow, it's really, going through the roof. And whereas in reality, it may not, be much more than a drop in the bucket, if you will.
This is true.
So there's a bit of that I want to sort of state. There is, of course, a lot of research on that in sub-Saharan Africa and also, importantly, in Latin America on these small Protestant churches, evangelical, Pentecostal, etc. And they definitely are powerful, institutions that shape who does what in society, including female engagement. My hunch would be it really depends on the denomination. So some are much more traditional than others. I was actually just in a town a couple of days ago. There's a really fascinating history of German Mennonites in Kyrgyzstan. You wouldn't believe it, but they came here in like the 19th century, not due to Stalin's sort of deportations of Germans. That happened later. They were here beforehand and founded these very strong Mennonite communities. And that would be an example of perhaps a community where, it's very strong, very clear separation of what men do, what women do, that might have a certain dampening effect of female engagement. Might be, I haven't studied it. There's other communities and other sects and denominations, I should say, where you might expect the opposite. So in religion, it's difficult because there's just so many groups under the sun that you can almost find evidence for anything.
This is true.
And so difficult to say. I think in Kyrgyzstan, more broadly at the aggregate level, I wouldn't expect Christianity in particular to have a strong effect because it's just a small group. So it's a small phenomenon that may have an effect in one village or the other, but it's not a kind of phenomenon that really is relevant to understanding politics more broadly in Kyrgyzstan or other Central Asian countries, would be my hunch.
Just not a tangent, but a fun fact. I'm from a very rural town in southern Illinois, and there is a huge Mennonite and Amish population. Yeah, and it's very, very popular, even for like pop culture, just to like go down there, buy some bread, get the furniture, eat all these like random pickled vegetables.
Yeah.
But yeah, everyone speaks German in these areas too.
I mean, these Mennonites mostly migrated or emigrated to the US from Russia, or Imperial Russia at the time, now modern day Ukraine. So that's where they are coming from. And they got there, and these are actually the areas where they settled, is where the war is taking place right now, right next to the Dnieper River. And anyways, they were sent there, and it's a fascinating history. They were sent there, or went there rather. There was an invitation because in Germany at the time, Prussia had instituted a draft. The Mennonites are very much against violence. So they ended up in Ukraine, then ended up in the US, and then moved on further to Mexico, Belize, Bolivia. It's a crazy story. And some ended up in Kyrgyzstan, which is I think the farthest place the Mennonites in a way traveled east.
So where are they dispersed in Kyrgyzstan?
Well, they started off in Talas, which is this small valley. Kyrgyzstan, it's interesting because lots of mountains and then some super fertile valleys. So it's just fascinating. And there's this one sliver of a valley bordering Kazakhstan, Talas. And they started there, started a few communities there. Were colonists in that sense, got the property, made the land arable. And then they moved further on to east of Bishkek. Rotfront is the town. There's another couple of towns. And started there. And then, of course, most of them went back to Germany in the early 90s because the German government allowed anyone with any claim to German ethnicity to come back to Germany. So they were fairly liberal for anyone who's ethnically German, which also has a funny, weird racial undertone, but that's exactly what it was. Yeah.
Okay. But there's still some left to this day.
Few. There are a few left. Not many.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do they have communes or...
Well, I don't know, but as far as I have read, or again, I drove there and walked around a little bit. They still have a church, and they have some sort of German teaching. There's a German teacher there, so there's still some community spirit, but it's a very small community now. It used to be much bigger.
Okay. Sticking to ethnicity and moving forward to some of the statistics. Your sample size is 5,100 Kyrgyz women across 150 villages in 3 provinces. I'm curious what provinces were selected and why did you choose those provinces?
Right, so let me just quickly pull up the paper. So we chose 3 provinces, mostly, I should say, due to logistical reasons. So in a project like that, of course, you would want to have sort of a representative sample of all of Kyrgyzstan. But Kyrgyzstan is, very hilly, so you have to strike some balance. We try to strike a balance of rural communities, but that sort of map. So we have Jalalabad, we have Narin, and we have Isikul. And Isikul is sort of the whole territory near the lake, which has a very strong presence still to this day of Russians, Imperial Russia, strong sort of background there. Narin is more Kyrgyz, and then Jalalabad is more southern. So we have a nice balance there of Kyrgyzstan, and that's how we chose those villages. But there was also some, of course, cooperation with the partner who implemented the program in what villages are chosen, where it's feasible to do the study. These kinds of questions are important too. So you want to strike a balance there between, is it representative of the country overall, and what does that even mean, and can you do the study in a credible manner?
That's really cool. I think that is a really good snapshot of some important demographics. Yeah. You answered part of this, but I think this question is still worth asking. Within this sample, is there representation from other ethnic groups such as Uzbeks, Dungans, Russians, etc.?
No, there isn't, as far as I can tell. We are almost, not looking at it, I think we're 96% Kyrgyz. So practically all Kyrgyz. You touch an important point, which is fascinating, that you have many villages, of course, where you have incredible ethnic diversity. I was just doing qualitative interviews near Isikul, near Karakol. and then you have Russians, you have Dungans, you know, what else? You have Kalmyk, you have Germans, you have all these ethnic groups, Uzbek, Kazakh, Chinese, you know, it just goes on and on.
Yes.
Uyghurs. So that's an interesting study in and of itself. We wanted to somehow keep the study focused on mostly Kyrgyz communities, but you can't, of course, you are hard pressed to find a village in Kyrgyzstan that has 100% Kyrgyz. But we wanted to find regions that are, you know, mostly Kyrgyz.
Okay.
Because the ethnic diversity, of course, presents another contextual variable that is very interesting, but also adds more noise to the analysis when you try to understand political engagement. Because these villages, of course, maybe it's not so much female versus male, but it might be Russian versus Kyrgyz versus Kazakh, etc. And then it's the division or the inequality might be more dominant along a different line that we were interested in. So we were interested in female-male differences, and that's why we chose mostly Kyrgyz villages.
I think it's a very important point for the readers and the listeners to understand is there's a deliberate effort to capture Kyrgyz as opposed to just a shotgun blast of other demographics. With this in mind, let's dive into some of the reading. Drawing from a representative sample of 5,100 Kyrgyz women across 150 villages and 3 provinces, we present 4 core findings. First, we show that Kyrgyz women update their beliefs regarding social norms in line with the treatment information. Informing women about high societal support for female political activism leads women to believe that others view female engagement more positively. The common knowledge treatment, in turn, leads women to update their beliefs about what other community members think about prevailing social norms. Again, with vocabulary terms, can you tell us what the common knowledge treatment is?
Yeah. So this is important. I think the core idea in the study is that first, we tell Kyrgyz women what others are thinking about female political engagement. So we walk up to Kyrgyz women and say, what's your opinion? Okay, thank you. This is what other women think about female political engagement. That's one thing. And I'll talk a little bit more about the precise way that was done, but that's the essential idea. That's the first thing we did. And the second thing, we told women, some women I should say, we are also giving this information to others. And that's the idea that we're creating common knowledge. And that gets at pluralistic ignorance. So you might yourself be learning something new. That's great. But what if no one else learns about it? Then it really is a drop in the bucket. But if we also tell you, look, we're telling this to other people as well, then you're not only learning a new piece of information about what others are thinking, but you also know others know about this as well. Mm-hmm. And then you get this pluralistic ignorance problem. So that's the core idea of the study.
That was something that was kind of a hurdle for me, was like others thinking others, you know, so you have to keep like adjusting like from what point of view it's going to be. Yeah. But it's really, really interesting. Yeah. I would like to go over 3 core findings because, to be honest, I didn't see like 4th in there, but maybe you could mention it since I couldn't find it. In the first core finding, the experiment not only shifted individual beliefs about community norms, but also impacted second-order beliefs about what others believe others think about social norms related to Kyrgyz women's political activism. Can you explain the significance of these second-order beliefs and how they influence political engagement?
Well, I think that's exactly, this is a different way of saying that it is about this pluralistic ignorance problem, or more broadly, what others are thinking. And what we're trying to say there is that, look, we can change, giving you information about what others are thinking makes you update your beliefs about what others are thinking. Great. And also telling you, we are giving this information to others makes you update on what others are thinking, right? So it's just a way, a complicated way perhaps, of saying giving this kind of information does lead people to update their beliefs. And importantly, it might lead to people updating beliefs upward or downward, right? So if you think 50% of people are in favor of nuclear energy, let's say, and I'm telling you it's actually 70%, then you're updating upward. Okay. If I tell you, well, it's actually 30%, you're updating downward. So there's a little bit of that, right? That you can update upwards or downwards, depending on what information we're giving you.
Okay, so upward is more of a like quantity upward and downward.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's you're changing your beliefs.
Yes.
In other words.
Yes. Okay. So let's look at the second core finding of the article. And again, if I'm wrong, just tell me where I'm wrong. Kyrgyz women seem to be influenced more strongly by negative social norms, leading them to be less active in political engagement, while positive social norms do not appear to have the same level of impact in encouraging increased political engagement. If this is true, why is this?
Well, that is the million-dollar question in a way. And I think the core finding of the paper, and certainly not something we expected. So just to sort of rephrase it, is that we find negative social norms, learning about that others are sort of more negatively hold more negative beliefs about whether women should be active, dampens female political engagement. But the same is not true for the opposite case, where you learn that society is more positive about female engagement. Now that, I think, is perplexing, super interesting. In a way, it's like you can make people inactive, but you can't make them active. Mm-hmm. It's like, I can lead you to not do something, but I can't get you to do something. Maybe it's not surprising to other people, I don't know. And maybe there is, of course, some psychological studies on just that phenomenon in a way. But it's interesting to see it play out in this setting, in this context, and also in such a rigorous experimental way. Because, of course, everything I should mention was randomly assigned. So we always have a clean control group. So we know exactly that really when women learn others are more negatively, hold more negative attitudes towards female engagement, they withdraw from the community. But if they learn others have more positive opinions, they do not engage more. Now, we saw that, and it's, of course, a bit depressing because it's like, well, you can sort of reduce engagement, but you can't spark it. That's a bit sad, I guess, from a policy perspective. We're now trying to figure out why that is. Our explanation is that it has to do with if you do more than what is expected, you might fear punishment. So you feel like society might be like, you shouldn't be doing this. We don't want this. So there's a whole bunch of punishment mechanisms that might unfold. Gossip, not being invited, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas if you do less, that and others want you to do more, there's no punishment that's happening there. Or rather, the potential praise you might be getting from doing more because others want you to do more is just not as motivating. It's like you might get, and it's interesting to think about, like, I mean, even in societies, like how many mechanisms do we have to praise others? It's like, it's very little. Even in, in Germany, there's this interesting sayings like, if I don't criticize you, that's praise enough. Like, that's the extent of which Germans can praise. It's like the best you can get is not to be criticized. And then there's a whole litany of punishment mechanisms. So that might explain why you see a negative effect, but not a positive effect, to put it simply. I should mention all of this only happens when we tell women that all others know about this as well. There are absolutely no effects on political engagement if women are not informed that others also get this information, which is really interesting and really speaks to this idea that you learning stuff is not going to change much. Society overall needs to learn for these punishment, praise mechanisms, et cetera, to kick in. Yeah.
To me, that sounds like a logical leap to get to this explanation. And before you deduced this explanation, was there like another off-the-cuff assumption maybe you had or another researcher?
Well, you're absolutely right. Good point. We don't know why that is. This is always the problem in science. You might establish a causal relation, X causes Y. Why that is the case is super difficult to pin down. It's a bit of a hornet's nest. It's also difficult methodological to get at. This is the information, I should say, or the explanation we've gotten based on qualitative interviews, talking to people, that seems the most consistent explanation. And we're now developing a bunch of sort of follow-up questions and a survey to get at that very question. There is, I should mention this here, also an interesting anecdote we've been told that explains this on the basis of sort of Kyrgyz Soviet history, that supposedly there was a strong norm of you don't want to do more than what society wants you to do. You don't want to be the know-it-all, the person that does it extra well. So it's just like you don't want to be the one that charters ahead. You want to stay within the pack. Mm-hmm. Falling behind, on the other hand, is not that problematic. So if you do less than others, it's not great, but it's not that big of a problem. Bigger problem is if you want to be the one that does more than everyone else. Mm-hmm. There's an interesting Russian proverb, which I don't want to butcher now, but that goes into that direction too. I think it's something like any initiative goes punished, or there's no initiative that doesn't go punished.
Yeah.
And that's the idea. It's like you better not do more because no initiative goes unpunished.
Yes.
Doing less is a bit safer.
Yeah. No good deed goes unpunished.
Maybe that is the English translation.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes. With Elnora being a Kyrgyz woman, did she have the same amount of shock as the other researchers, or did she have another insight that she had a personal explanation of?
Yeah. No, I think we, of course, Elnora being a co-author, we discussed this quite a bit with her, and also with other women in her team that do similar projects, co-authors of hers, colleagues of hers. They were, my reading was they were surprised in a sense, but then it made a lot of sense. It's like they didn't expect it, but they can absolutely rationalize it, which was reassuring to me, because I should, again, preface this. I am not from Kyrgyzstan. I haven't studied female political engagement in Kyrgyzstan. So there's all these, I'm not a woman, clearly. And so there's all these things that make me want to rely all that more on qualitative evidence and contextualization of women in particular that really know this context. So that's why it's so important to have Elnora on the team. Yeah. So I guess the question is, what's the comparison group? And I don't have a great comparison group. I can't tell you what is happening in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. One thing I will say is that for the broader Metaketa project, which is not this paper that we talked about now, but it's this other intervention that we did, which was a collective efficacy intervention. One really neat way of measuring political engagement was to ask communities to submit a grant proposal to potentially obtain funding for a investment in the community. And so that was done by DPI, or it was organized by DPI. We received a lot of applications, and it's really interesting in what direction these applications are going. I should say, I haven't looked at all of them, but and I will at some point, but the communities, and then the women in particular, do not ask for things that are out of the ordinary, if you will. So it's fairly standard things. It's like investments in a school, investments in a playground, investments in education, in perhaps infrastructure. So these kinds of things. So really the idea is that you try to build your community, and it would be the traditional things that a community is interested in. So there's nothing sort of crazy when it comes to what women push for in their communities. They're very sensible, demands, but they're very important at the same time to be voiced by women, because I'm sure there are differences to what men would ask for, but that we haven't studied, right? So because we've exclusively focused on women in this study.
Okay. I would like to talk about some hard numbers in your research, and truly I think that your explanation of the second core finding has probably satisfied a lot of the questions I could ask, but I'll read off some statistics and just tell me if there's any additional information you'd like to say about it, or a comment here or there. And I wanted to use a particular quote, but when I read the entire paragraph, it was fascinating to me. Figure 2 plots women's beliefs about what others believe, how many women out of 100 should be politically active, as well as what others believe about others' opinion regarding female activism. There are two striking facts. First, the representative sample of women shows a strong conviction that many women should be active in politics, at 92%. Second, the same women, however, believe that others are much less favorable towards female engagement. Specifically, women believe others want only 70% of women to be active. Third, and even more striking, the sample of women thinks that others hold even more negative views of what others think regarding female engagement. On average, women believe that others think that others only want 62% of women to be active. The figure thus shows that as the order of beliefs increases, women become more skeptical. Put differently, there's a pluralistic ignorance in that women think others think more negatively about female political engagement. Again, your second explanation, it satisfied it, but any comments on these statistics?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and it's a staggering figure in a way, is that when you ask women privately, almost 100% think that 100% of women should be active in politics. It's not 100%, but it's like 92% of people really want women to be more active. That's almost everyone. Then you ask these people, and that's the average of society. You ask them, what do they think that others think? And all of a sudden it drops to 70%. So it's a 30 percentage point reduction. And that they should be saying exactly the same figure because it's a representative sample, right? So on average, again, everyone, 92% want women to do more. And you ask them, what do you think that figure essentially is? They think it's 70%. So it goes down to 70. And then perhaps even more striking, if you then ask them, what do you think others think about others? It goes down even further. It goes down to 62% or something. So there's another sort of almost 10 percentage point drop, which just shows this sort of spiraling of negative assumptions about what others are thinking about female engagement.
Spiraling is the right word.
Yeah. Well, at some point, it's funny because there isn't a great game theoretic paper that looks at this in a different setting, but it's this idea like, what do others think about others? And what do others think about others about others? And so you can go on and on and on. So we haven't done that, of course, because at some point it gets ridiculous and it's also difficult to even implement.
Sure.
So even what others think about others is already like something you have to wrap your head around. Then if you continue, it gets a little bit funny.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you would explain the others think because it's so much easier to listen to from you.
Yeah.
Going back to the idea of pluralistic ignorance, was there any difference in pluralistic ignorance among women living in tight-knit communities versus larger communities?
That's an excellent question. It's something we want to look at. We haven't looked at it because we were somewhat constrained in how many questions we can add to the survey, but we want to match a different survey set, which is the aforementioned Life in Kyrgyzstan panel study, to our data set in order to get exactly at that question, whether these findings are conditioned by how tightly knit a community is. You could see this perhaps meaning there's even more potential punishment mechanisms, but it could also be that there's more praise, right? So it's not quite clear in what direction this goes, but it's definitely something we want to look into.
Interesting. We're getting closer to the conclusion of the essay. Mm-hmm. And by the time I get to the conclusion, I think here's some of the most important findings. Overall, the paper demonstrates the significance of common knowledge about prevailing social norms in influencing political behavior, privately providing information about expert opinions on support for female political engagement does not lead to behavior change. When women are aware of common knowledge about social norms that are critical of female participation, they adjust their political behavior and become less politically active. And importantly, you, the researchers, hypothesize that this behavioral adjustment is driven by the fear of social punishment rather than the potential for social praise, which shapes political behavior. I think that's the crux, like you talked about. And we talked more about the future of this paper. The research mentions your plans to collect additional evidence on mechanisms behind the observed effects. Could you give us a glimpse into these potential mechanisms?
Right. So I think it's exactly this idea that there's some form of expected punishment or praise that we need to substantiate. This means, on the one hand, trying to figure out what kind of punishment and praise mechanisms are there. What are people relaying to us? Is this something that's happening at the sort of more, fundamental level? The second thing is to ask, what kind of expectations do people have about, does this happen? To what extent, how likely is it to happen? how painful, quote unquote, is it, or how beneficial is it? So these kinds of questions as well. We're also toying with the idea of experimentally varying some of these things using vignettes, is what it's called, to tell people a certain story. Imagine a person and then they're being punished. How do you think they will act? So to sort of have these mental hypothetical scenarios and see whether the same effects unfold when we provide a context within which punishment or praise is unfolding in a local village. So that's what we want to do to get at exactly that mechanism.
Okay. And now we're going to get into some final questions that is going to make me look like a condescending jerk. I'm sorry for these complicated, wordy questions in advance. Based on your research, what are the most significant implications for policymakers and organizations striving to promote gender equality and women's political engagement in traditional societies like Kyrgyzstan?
Yeah, policy questions are always difficult because, as this paper shows, I guess, life is complicated and changing political engagement for sure is too. If I were pressed, I would say the first takeaway is that it's really important to tackle what others think about others, or what people think what others think. This is really key. Many, information campaigns or many, these kinds of interventions target individuals. So it's like, please do not drink, or please don't drive fast. And I think the takeaway here and in many other studies is, well, it's great to update your thinking about a certain topic, but what may be more important is to update your thinking about what others are thinking. Mm-hmm. Because again, we're social, creatures, and we depend on what others are doing and how they structure our behaviors, and whether there's, again, punishment, praise, etc. So this is important to really keep in mind, that it's important to tell people or to take into consideration that it's about what others are thinking that really matters a great deal. And I think this is what this study really shows. The second thing, perhaps very practically, is, of course, this pluralistic ignorance is alive and well, at least in Kyrgyzstan. So it's really something to keep in mind, and there may be ways to communicate exactly that phenomenon, which might be fruitful in changing behavior regarding female engagement, but also other forms of social behavior. That's the second thing. The third thing, I'm a little bit more skeptical about: how can this evidence be used to spark activism, if that's something an NGO or a government wishes to do? Because we don't really find many ways to do so. We really only show there is a potential path to reduce activism. So maybe that's good for behavior that you want to reduce, such as, drunk driving, things like that. But it seems much more difficult to elicit or spark behavior into the positive direction, or into the activist direction. So maybe that is not the right way in which to invest money if a government, NGO, etc., wants to do that. If they still want to do that, which of course there's some things, for example, you want to, abolish female genital mutilation, these kinds of things. Of course, NGOs and governments still, they shouldn't take this evidence and be like, okay, we can't change behavior. Maybe a way to go forward is to think a little bit more about priming potential praise and alleviating concerns about punishment. If that is the mechanism that's operative. We only have qualitative anecdotal evidence on that. But that might be ways to really push, why don't you become more active? Others want this as well, and there's potential upsides, and don't worry about the downsides because they're actually not as salient. Mm-hmm. So that might be one way to structure an intervention like that to elicit positive change, but that's just my hypothesis. We have to check it.
Okay. So that's at the micro level. I want to try to downsize the scope a little bit more, but the answer still may be very similar to what I'll ask next. You explain like the policy level, but what can be the role of community leaders in mitigating this fear and instead foster support?
Well, I think community leaders are important for sure, especially in very religious communities, very tightly knit communities. And because they do two things, they are symbols and role models of what others perceive society's opinion to be, right? So if the priest says, this is what we should do, or this is what society thinks, that's what people tend to believe. So these people are extremely important as sort of intermediaries or distribution mechanisms of both punishment and praise mechanisms, but also perceptions about norms. So it's important to keep them in the loop. But that's something that most NGOs and policymakers do. I mean, they realize that it's important to get community leaders on board and have them, push certain messages. If, of course, the community leader is one that is very opposed, that is really a tough situation to change. So, yeah.
Finally, that's all I have. In case I've missed anything, do you have any concluding thoughts or something you'd like to mention about this study?
We've gone through quite a bit, so thank you. I think it's just, I want to encourage people, I think, to study Central Asia a little bit more. It's interesting. I mean, in our discipline, we have certain countries and regions that are studied much more than others. And to my impression, Central Asia certainly is a region where there's not that much focus, which is surprising because it is a region that has a lot of really interesting, as I mentioned, sort of things intersecting. I mean, this is a region situated between China, sort of Turkic influence, Iran, and Russia. There's, Islamic, nomadic, Soviet history, strong Chinese influence, speak a Turkic language. So there's all this amazing depth and richness that I think is really interesting for social scientists. And I say that partly because, very selfishly, when we started this project, of course, you want to read what have others done. And there's surprisingly little evidence, at least in the sort of more quantitatively inclined fields such as economics, sociology, political science on Central Asia. It's not to say there's nothing, for sure. There is something. But if you go to other countries like, Argentina, Uganda, you have many, many more studies. And that's surprising. And I wonder if my hunch is that it's such a fertile laboratory to study so many questions that I think more people should study Central Asia.
So thank you so much for coming on the podcast, the very, very first edition. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and good luck with the podcast.
Thank you so much.